In the mid-1930s, as the storm clouds of war gathered over Europe, an idea was born in the minds of American military strategists, an idea destined to change the face of warfare forever. It was the concept of an aerial dreadnought, a gigantic, heavily armed bomber capable of crossing oceans and delivering pinpoint surgical strikes against industrial and military targets deep in enemy territory. It was the dream of a war without the blood and mud of the trenches, a war that could be won by paralyzing the enemy's economy without engaging in direct ground combat. Leading U.S. aviation companies competed to create such an aircraft, but the design submitted by the Boeing company surpassed them all. Their Model 299 was a true marvel of engineering, a massive, four-engine, all-metal monoplane that was stunning in its size and sleek, predatory beauty. During its first demonstration flight in July 1935, one reporter, impressed by the fuselage bristling with machine gun nests, exclaimed, "Why, it's a real flying fortress." The nickname stuck, becoming the official name for the future B-17 bomber. The Flying Fortress was the embodiment of a new military philosophy. Its creators believed that a tight formation of these high-altitude bombers could defend itself. 10, and in later models, up to 13, heavy-caliber machine guns positioned throughout the fuselage were meant to create an impenetrable dome of fire around the bomber armada, lethal to any fighter that dared to approach. They didn't need escorts. They were both sword and shield. Paired with this unbreakable shield was a high-precision sword, the legendary Norden bomb sight. This was a complex mechanical device, a small analog computer that, its creators claimed, could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The theory seemed flawless. Armadas of flying fortresses would take off, cross enemy territory with minimal losses from fighters and anti-aircraft fire, destroy key military factories, bridges, and power plants with surgical precision, and then return to base unharmed. War would become like a chess match, where precise, calculated strikes determined the outcome. This theory so captivated the minds of the American military that by the time the U.S. entered World War II, the B-17 had become the cornerstone of its strategic air force. Thousands of these machines rolled off the assembly lines of Boeing, Douglas, and Vega factories. Thousands of young American men, yesterday's farmers, students, and clerks, took accelerated courses to become pilots, navigators, and gunners, ready to take their places inside these steel monsters. They flew to England, to the front lines of this new air war, full of faith in their weapon and in the doctrine that promised a swift and nearly bloodless victory. They were certain their flying fortresses were invincible and their bomb sights infallible. They believed they were about to wage a new, clean, technological war. But soon, they would come face to face with a harsh reality, the fog and clouds over Europe that made precise targeting impossible, and the ferocious resistance of German fighter pilots who were prepared to do anything to defend their skies. The dream of a surgical war was about to be drowned in blood. In the summer of 1942, an American air army landed in East Anglia, among its sleepy villages, evergreen fields, and misty lowlands. This was the 8th U.S. Air Force, an army that would put the theory of strategic bombing to the test. From hundreds of hastily built airfields that turned this quiet region into the world's largest aircraft carrier, armadas of flying fortresses were to take to the skies and bring the industry of the Third Reich to its knees. The first combat mission took place on August 17, 1942. 12 B-17E bombers, escorted by British Spitfires, struck a railway yard in Rouen in northern France. The operation was a success. There were no losses, and the bombs hit their target. Jubilation reigned at headquarters. It seemed the theory worked, but this was only the deceptive calm before the storm. Very quickly, American pilots encountered the two main enemies that would haunt them until the very end of the war: the European weather and German air defenses. The first enemy was unpredictable and treacherous. The perpetually overcast skies above Germany and France made a mockery of the idea of surgical strikes. The legendary Norden bomb sight, which was supposed to be able to hit a pickle barrel, was useless if the bombardier couldn't see the barrel itself. The planes would circle for hours over the target, trying to find a break in the clouds, burning precious fuel and becoming easy targets for anti-aircraft guns. Often, having failed to find their primary objective, they would drop their bombs on secondary targets or simply jettison them over an open field to lighten the aircraft for the return journey. But the second enemy was far more terrifying. This was the Luftwaffe pilots and the flak crews. The German air defense system was the most advanced in the world. Hundreds of fighter squadrons, equipped with fast and heavily armed Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, were linked into a single network with thousands of radar stations and flak batteries. As soon as the American bombers crossed the coast, a real hunt began. The theory of the self-defending bomber shattered against the reality of aerial combat. The tight formation of fortresses, which seemed impregnable on paper, actually had numerous blind spots, especially from the front. German pilots quickly found these vulnerabilities. They developed head-on attack tactics, flying straight through the American armadas while raking them with cannon and machine gun fire. A single accurate burst into the cockpit or an engine, and the huge bomber, engulfed in flames, would peel away from the formation and fall. A bomber that fell behind its formation was doomed. Like a wounded bison, it would be pounced upon by a pack of fighters and coolly finished off. The chances of surviving this meat grinder were practically zero. Every flight became a lottery. During the first year of combat, only 36% of crews managed to complete their tour of 25 combat missions. The rest were shot down, captured, or listed as missing in action. American generals in England, seeing the devastating losses, sent desperate dispatches to Washington demanding escort fighters, but there were none with sufficient range. The only fighters the Allies had in large enough numbers, the British Spitfires and American P-47 Thunderbolts, lacked the range to accompany the bombers deep into Germany. They could only cover them over the coast before dipping their wings and returning to base, leaving the fortresses to face the German predators alone. The dream of a clean, bloodless war was dissolving in the smoke of burning aircraft. Every mission was a feat of courage, every return to base a miracle. But the worst was yet to come. American command, despite the losses, was determined to prove its doctrine right. They prepared a series of deep raids on Germany's most vital industrial centers. These raids were meant to break the back of the German war machine. Instead, they almost broke the back of the 8th Air Force itself. The morning of October 14, 1943, was cold and bleak. On the airfields of East Anglia, 3,000 American airmen shivered in the damp as they prepared for another mission. When the target was announced at the briefing, a heavy sigh went through the hangars. Schweinfurt, this small Bavarian town, was synonymous with the word death. It was here that the factories producing ball bearings were located, tiny but vital components for the entire war machine of the Third Reich, for its tanks, aircraft, and submarines. Destroying these factories was an obsession for the American command. The first raid on Schweinfurt in August had already ended in a bloodbath, with 36 fortresses lost. Now, 2 months later, the 8th Air Force was returning to finish the job. 291 B-17 bombers were to deliver a crushing blow to Germany's ball-bearing industry, but this day would go down in history not as a triumph, but as Black Thursday, the day of the greatest slaughter in the skies over Europe. From the very beginning, everything went wrong. Thick fog delayed the takeoff of the escort fighters, and the bombers were forced to fly to the target alone. As soon as the armada crossed the coast, it was pounced upon by Luftwaffe fighters like a pack of hungry wolves. Hundreds of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs scrambled from dozens of airfields to meet the uninvited guests. This was not just an attack, it was a methodical, cold-blooded slaughter. German pilots, having perfected their head-on attack tactics, tore through the fortress formations, blasting them with their cannons. The twin-engine Bf-110 fighters, too slow for maneuverable combat, used a new weapon, unguided WFR grade 21 rockets, which they launched from a safe distance to break up the dense bomber formations. The sky turned into hell. It was filled with the black puffs of flak bursts, the fiery tracers of machine gun fire, and the smoky trails of falling aircraft. Every minute, another B-17, engulfed in flames, would peel away from the formation. Some exploded in mid-air, disintegrating into thousands of fiery pieces. Others, with their controls shot away, went into a spin as tiny figures with parachutes tumbled from their hatches. The radio waves were flooded with desperate screams, reports of downed aircraft, and calls for help. Despite the horrific losses, the armada pressed on toward the target. Through the smoke and explosions, bombardiers peered into their sights, trying to lock the factory buildings in their crosshairs. Bombs rained down on Schweinfurt, inflicting significant but not fatal damage. But the worst was yet to come. The journey home. On the return trip, German fighters renewed their attacks with doubled fury. Their main targets now were the damaged bombers that had fallen behind. They finished them off ruthlessly and methodically. The American gunners, exhausted from the hours-long battle, their hands frostbitten, fought back to the last bullet. The long-awaited escort fighters arrived too late, only able to cover the retreat of those lucky enough to have survived. The results of the day were catastrophic. 60 flying fortresses failed to return to their bases. Another 17 were written off due to heavy damage. Over 600 crewmen were killed, wounded, or captured. The 8th Air Force was bled dry. Black Thursday was the moment of truth. It proved conclusively that the doctrine of the self-defending bomber was dead. Without fighter cover for the entire route, deep raids into Germany were suicide. American command was forced to admit defeat. For several months, daylight raids on targets in Germany were halted. It seemed the air war had been lost. But beyond this despair, a new dawn of hope was already breaking. On American factory floors, an aircraft was already rolling off the assembly line, an aircraft destined to change everything. Black Thursday was a sobering moment for the 8th Air Force. It became clear that the doctrine of the self-defending bomber was a deadly illusion. The generals in their headquarters finally understood what downed airmen and squadron commanders had been desperately reporting. Without escort fighters capable of protecting the fortresses all the way to the target and back, the air war against Germany was lost. But where could they get such a fighter? None of the existing aircraft, neither the British Spitfire nor the American Thunderbolt, had the range for such long-range missions. And that's when it arrived, sleek and fast, with a teardrop canopy and predatory lines, the P-51 Mustang fighter. Its story was a miracle in itself. The aircraft was originally designed by North American Aviation for a British contract, but with its American Allison engine, its performance was mediocre. The plane was fast, but its performance suffered at high altitudes where the main air battles took place. But British engineers, recognizing the airframe's superb aerodynamics, made a brilliant move. They fitted the Mustang with their own engine, the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same one that powered the Spitfire. The result exceeded all expectations. The aircraft was transformed. It became not just fast, but the king of high altitude, surpassing nearly all German fighters in speed, maneuverability, and rate of climb. But its greatest advantage was its phenomenal range, thanks to its laminar flow wing, which created minimal aerodynamic drag, and its huge fuel tanks. The Mustang could fly almost 3,000 kilometers. With external drop tanks, it was able to escort the flying fortresses to the most distant targets in Germany, to Berlin, Munich, and Schweinfurt, and all the way back. Starting in late 1943, Mustangs began to arrive in large numbers to equip the 8th Air Force. For the bomber crews, they became guardian angels, affectionately nicknamed Little Friends. The sight of a P-51 squadron taking up position above the bomber formation filled the airmen's hearts with hope and confidence. The air battles over Germany changed beyond recognition. Now, when German fighters rushed to attack the fortresses, they were met not only by machine gun fire from the bombers, but also by the deadly fire of the Mustangs. American pilots were ordered not just to escort the bombers, but to go on a free hunt, to actively seek out and destroy the enemy. They roamed above the bomber formations, engaging German fighters and clearing the way for the bombers they protected. The turkey shoot was over. Now, the wolf hunt went both ways. German aces, accustomed to shooting down the lumbering fortresses with impunity, now faced an equal and often superior opponent. Luftwaffe losses began to grow exponentially. In just a few months of fighting in the spring of 1944, the German fighter arm was virtually bled dry. It wasn't just aircraft that were lost. It was experienced, irreplaceable pilots. By the summer of 1944, at the time of the Normandy landings, the skies over Europe belonged to the Allies. Air superiority had been won, and it was won thanks to this elegant fighter that appeared at the most critical moment. The Mustang didn't just save the flying fortresses, it saved the entire concept of daylight strategic bombing, opening the way to the very heart of the Third Reich. Now, under the protection of their little friends, the bombers could sow death and destruction with impunity, and they were preparing to turn Germany's cities into flaming ruins. This was their world, an aluminum box, buffeted by the winds, crammed with bombs, ammunition, and complex equipment. 10 men locked in this cramped space for 8, 10, and sometimes 12 hours. 10 lives dependent on each other and on the whims of war. The crew of a B-17 wasn't just a team, it was a family, a brotherhood, a single organism fighting for survival in the most hostile place on earth, the sky over the Third Reich. Their day began long before dawn, a wake-up call at 3 in the morning, a quick breakfast of eggs, bacon and coffee, and then the briefing. In a smoke-filled hangar, on a huge map covered by a cloth, an intelligence officer would reveal the target. Their chances of coming home that day depended on which red thread stretched from England deep into Europe. Then, it was time to gear up. Each crewman wore about 18 kilograms of equipment, heavy sheepskin flight suits, flak jackets, parachutes, and oxygen masks. Inside the bomber, it was cramped and uncomfortable. The 10 crew members took their posts. In the nose, inside a plexiglass bubble, sat the navigator and the bombardier, the brains of the operation. Behind them in the cockpit were the pilot and co-pilot. Below the top turret was the flight engineer. In the central compartment, the radio operator. And in the rear, 3 gunners, 2 at the waist and 1 in the tail, occupying the loneliest and most dangerous position on the plane. The flight to the target was monotonous and exhausting, but the greatest enemy wasn't the opposition, it was the cold. At an altitude of 9,000 meters, the temperature outside dropped to minus 50 degrees Celsius. The frost penetrated every gap, stiffened their movements, and turned their weapons into useless chunks of ice. The electrically heated flight suits often failed, and the men suffered from severe frostbite. Added to the cold was hypoxia, oxygen starvation. They could only breathe through masks connected to the onboard system. A failure in the oxygen system meant a swift loss of consciousness and death. But all of this was just a prelude to the real hell that began over enemy territory. As soon as the plane crossed the coast, a short chilling order would come over the intercom. Fighters at 3 o'clock. And the work would begin. The world narrowed to the crosshairs of a machine gun sight. Hearts pounded, and hands in heavy gloves struggled to grip the weapons, the air filled with the roar of machine guns, the smell of cordite, and shouts over the intercom. "Number 4 is on fire. Radio operator is hit. They're coming in from the tail." The bomber shuddered from nearby flak bursts, and shrapnel hammered against the fuselage like hail. At any second, a cannon shell could hit the plane and turn it into a fireball. Fear was a constant companion, but there was no time for it. Everyone did their job. The pilots fought to keep the plane in formation because a straggler was doomed. The navigator, ignoring the chaos, guided the plane to its target. The bombardier, lying over his bomb site, waited for that one single moment to press the release, and the gunners, spinning in their turrets, fired back desperately, trying to drive off the predators. Sometimes they got lucky. Damage, flying on 1 or 2 engines with wounded and dead on board, the plane would limp back to England and make an emergency landing. The crew would stumble out onto the ground, pale and with shaking hands, and kiss the concrete of the runway. They had survived. Today and tomorrow meant another mission. This would be repeated 25 times, 25 trips to hell and back. Anyone who completed the journey got a ticket home, but very few made it. Having conquered the skies, the Allies had a free hand. They could now do whatever they wanted with Germany's cities, and they wanted to make Germany pay. The idea of pinpoint strikes on military factories, which had never produced decisive results, gradually gave way to a new, much more terrifying doctrine, the doctrine of total destruction. The targets were no longer machines and assembly lines, but homes, streets, theaters, and hospitals. The target became the German people themselves. The Allies decided to break their will to resist, burying it under the ruins of cities and in the flames of firestorms. This new strategy was cynically called area bombing. In this, the Americans and the British acted as two hands of the same hammer. The British Royal Air Force, under the command of Air Marshal Arthur Butcher Harris, struck at night. Their heavy Lancaster and Halifax bombers dropped thousands of high-explosive and incendiary bombs on sleeping cities, turning them into blazing infernos. The American 8th Air Force continued its daylight raids, but now their targets became increasingly vague. Instead of a specific factory, they were often assigned an industrial area, which in practice meant the bombing of entire city districts. The culmination of this tactic was Operation Gomorrah, a series of raids on Hamburg in late July 1943. In 1 week, more than 9,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Germany's second largest city. The British bombed by night, the Americans by day. The result was a previously unseen phenomenon, a firestorm. Due to the temperature differences caused by thousands of simultaneous fires, a gigantic fiery vortex formed in the city center. Superheated air rushed upwards at hurricane speeds, sucking in everything around it. The temperature at the epicenter reached 800 degrees Celsius. The asphalt on the streets melted, and the glass in windows turned to liquid. People trying to flee were burned alive or suffocated in the superheated air. Hamburg was practically wiped off the face of the earth. More than 40,000 people died, mostly women, children, and the elderly. But the most controversial and tragic chapter in the history of strategic bombing was the raid on Dresden in February 1945. Dresden, the capital of Saxony, was a museum city, the Florence on the Elbe, with no major military or industrial significance. It was packed with refugees fleeing the advancing Red Army. On the night of February 13th and 14th, British and then American bombers turned the city into a burning hell. The same tactic used in Hamburg was employed. First high explosive bombs to destroy the roofs, then incendiaries to set the wooden structures ablaze. An estimated 25,000 to 100,000 people died in the firestorm. The military necessity of this raid is still fiercely debated today. Many historians consider it an act of senseless barbarism, a war crime committed when the outcome of the war was already a foregone conclusion. By the end of the war, 4/5 of German cities with populations over 100,000 lay in ruins. Millions of people were left homeless. More than 300,000 civilians died under Allied bombs. However, the main objective of this campaign, to break the morale of the German people, was never achieved. On the contrary, the constant bombings often only intensified their hatred for the enemy and their determination to fight to the end. But this campaign of terror had another, less obvious, but perhaps more important effect. It forced Germany to divert enormous resources to defending its cities. 1/3 of all artillery produced in the country consisted of anti-aircraft guns. Millions of people were diverted from production and mobilized into air defense services. The best fighter squadrons were pulled from the fronts to defend the Reich. And while Germany's cities burned, on the Eastern Front, where the fate of the war was being decided, the Wehrmacht lacked tanks, aircraft, and guns. The firestorm over Germany, while not breaking the spirit of the German people, bled their army dry. While British and American bombers were turning German cities into lunar landscapes, sparking debates about morality and military necessity, Allied strategists were searching for the Third Reich's Achilles' heel. They looked for that single critical point where a strike could paralyze the entire German war machine. In the spring of 1944, that point was found. It was oil, or rather, the lack of it. Unlike the United States or the Soviet Union, Germany had no significant domestic oil reserves. Almost all the fuel needed for its tanks, aircraft, and submarines was synthetic. It was produced at giant plants scattered throughout the country through a complex process of coal hydrogenation. These plants became the top priority for the American Air Force. In May 1944, the oil campaign began. It was the most focused and effective strategic bombing campaign of the entire war. Hundreds and then thousands of flying fortresses and liberators, escorted by armadas of Mustangs, began to methodically, day after day, destroy Germany's synthetic fuel plants. The targets were difficult. The plants at Leuna, Pulitz, and Merseburg were huge, well-defended complexes, bristling with thousands of anti-aircraft guns. The German command, recognizing the mortal threat, threw its last elite Luftwaffe squadrons into their defense. The skies above these plants became an arena for ferocious air battles, but the Americans, with their overwhelming numerical superiority and the reliable escort of the Mustangs, broke through to their targets time and again. The effect of these raids was almost immediate and catastrophic for Germany. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, later wrote in his memoirs that May 12, 1944, the day of the first massive raid on the synthetic oil plants, was a turning point in the war. The production of aviation fuel plummeted by nearly 90%. The consequences of this fuel shortage were immediate. Wehrmacht panzer divisions meant to counter the Allied landings in Normandy were immobilized for lack of fuel. Luftwaffe pilots, even with the new Me-262 jet fighters, couldn't take off to intercept the bombers. Their training programs were cut to a minimum, and inexperienced young pilots were thrown into battle, becoming easy prey for veteran American pilots. The great German ace Adolf Galland bitterly recalled that his pilots often couldn't even get airborne to defend their own airfields. The oil campaign was a clear example of what the entire strategic bombing effort could have been if, from the start, it had focused on the true vulnerabilities of the enemy's economy instead of on terrorizing the civilian population. The destruction of the oil refineries inflicted more damage on Germany than the burning of Hamburg and Dresden combined. It bled the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe dry, depriving them of the ability to wage war effectively. By the beginning of 1945, the German war machine was in its death throes. Its steel heart was still strong, but there was no blood left in its veins. It was suffocating, and as it suffocated in Europe, on the other side of the world, in the Pacific, American generals were already preparing an even more terrible fate for another empire. A new, more advanced and deadlier sky Leviathan was about to take the stage. While the B-17 flying fortresses were turning the cities of the Third Reich to rubble, their successor was being born in the secret design bureaus and on the assembly lines of Boeing. This was an aircraft destined to become the pinnacle of piston-engine bomber aviation, an absolute weapon created for a single purpose: to wage war across the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. Its name was the Boeing B-29, but it went down in history under a much more formidable nickname, the Superfortress. The B-29 was a true technological marvel, ahead of its time. Compared to it, the veteran B-17 looked almost like an anachronism. The Superfortress was larger, faster, flew higher, and carried twice the bomb load. But its main innovation was a fully pressurized crew cabin. For the first time in history, airmen didn't have to wear heavy, restrictive fur-lined suits or breathe through oxygen masks. They could carry out their mission in their standard uniforms as if they were in an office. It was a breakthrough that fundamentally changed the conditions of air warfare. Another revolutionary innovation was its defensive armament system. All machine gun turrets were remotely operated by a complex analog computer system. Gunners sat in comfortable pressurized compartments and, looking through their sights, controlled the guns as if in a video game. The system automatically corrected for speed, wind, and parallax. The Superfortress was the most well-defended bomber of its time. The B-29 was the most expensive U.S. military project of the Second World War. It cost $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project, to create the atomic bomb. The American command was betting heavily on this aircraft. It was intended to be the hammer that would crush Japan, sparing America the necessity of a bloody amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands. The first combat missions of the Superfortresses began in the summer of 1944 from airfields in China and India, but they immediately ran into what seemed like insurmountable difficulties. The logistics were a nightmare. All fuel, bombs, and spare parts had to be airlifted over the Himalayas, and in the skies over Japan, the Americans encountered a new, unknown enemy, the high-altitude jet stream. At an altitude of 10,000 meters, hurricane-force winds blowing at speeds up to 300 kilometers per hour threw the planes off course and made precision bombing absolutely impossible. The situation changed when the Americans captured the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. From their airfields built in record time, B-29s could strike anywhere in Japan. In November 1944, regular raids on Tokyo began, but the results were dismal. Bombs dropped from high altitude were scattered by the wind and clouds. Losses from mechanical failures and attacks by the few but determined Japanese fighters were mounting. It seemed that the wonder weapon, in which billions of dollars had been invested, was not living up to expectations. Gloom settled over the headquarters of the 20th Air Force. A new commander was needed, a man with an iron will, unconventional thinking, and a willingness to take the most desperate risks, and such a man was found. His name was General Curtis LeMay, and he was about to turn the entire doctrine of strategic bombing on its head. His decision was so radical and insane that many considered it suicidal, but it was this mad decision that was destined to turn Japan's cities to ash. In January 1945, a new commander arrived in the Mariana Islands to lead the 21st Bomber Command. This was Major General Curtis LeMay. Sullen, a man of few words, and with a perpetual cigar in his mouth, he had a reputation as one of the toughest and most effective commanders in the U.S. Army Air Forces. He was the one who had developed the combat box formations for the flying fortresses in Europe. Now, his job was to make the Superfortresses work. After analyzing the failures of his predecessor, LeMay came to a conclusion that would have seemed like pure madness to any other officer. He decided to abandon the entire American doctrine of strategic bombing, everything they believed in and took pride in. He decided to abandon daylight, high-altitude, precision attacks. His logic was simple and ruthless. Unlike German industry, Japanese industry was decentralized. Countless small workshops and factories were scattered throughout residential neighborhoods. Targeting them from high altitude was pointless. Furthermore, the high-altitude jet stream made precision bombing impossible, and Japanese air defenses were most effective at high altitudes. And LeMay made a decision that shocked his own staff. He ordered his crews to attack at night. Japanese night fighters were few, and their air defenses were practically blind in the dark. Attack from low altitudes. Instead of 10,000 meters, the planes were to fly at 1.5 to 2 kilometers, which would avoid the wind and increase accuracy. Attack with incendiary bombs. LeMay knew that Japanese cities were a sea of wood and paper. He decided not to target individual factories, but to burn entire urban areas to the ground, along with their industry and population. Remove the defensive armament. To carry as many incendiary bombs as possible, LeMay ordered that nearly all machine guns and their ammunition be removed from the aircraft. The super fortresses were to fly to the target practically defenseless. This was pure madness. He was sending the most expensive planes in the world to low altitude into the teeth of enemy flak, virtually unarmed. Many pilots and squadron commanders were convinced they were being sent to their certain deaths, but LeMay was adamant. "If this raid fails," he said, "I'll be sent back to the States to command a depot for the rest of the war." But he was confident in his calculations, cruel, cynical, but mathematically precise. He was betting everything: his career, the lives of hundreds of airmen, and hundreds of aircraft. The first test raids on Kobe and other cities proved him right. The wooden houses burned like matchsticks. American losses were minimal. LeMay knew he had found the key to victory, and he prepared to deliver a blow that would become the most terrifying and destructive bombing raid in human history. His target was Tokyo. LeMay later admitted, "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." He understood perfectly that he was blurring the line between military and civilian targets, between war and mass murder. But for him, it was just brutal arithmetic. He believed that one devastating blow that would kill 100,000 people, but bring the war to a faster end and save the lives of 1 million American soldiers who might die in an invasion, was a justified price. LeMay's madness was cold and calculated, and it was about to be unleashed on the Japanese capital in a devastating firestorm. On the evening of March 9, 1945, B-29 bombers began rising one after another from the airfields on the Mariana Islands. 334 superfortresses, heavily loaded with incendiary bombs and napalm, set a course for Tokyo. Operation Meeting House was underway, a raid that would go down in history as the most destructive and deadliest non-nuclear bombing raid in human history. The crews flew in tense silence. Most of the machine guns had been removed, and the gunners sat idle, peering into the darkness and praying that Japanese fighters wouldn't spot them. LeMay had gambled that Japan's night air defenses were weak, and that gamble paid off. Resistance was minimal. Shortly after midnight, the first Pathfinder aircraft dropped their bombs, marking a giant, fiery cross in the heart of Tokyo, in one of the most densely populated areas in the world, where hundreds of thousands of workers and their families were crowded into wooden, barrack-like homes. And then, the inferno began. The main wave of bombers, flying at an altitude of just 1.5 kilometers, began to methodically unload its deadly cargo. Thousands of M69 cluster incendiary bombs fell on the paper roofs, piercing them and exploding inside the houses, spraying burning napalm in all directions. In 2.5 hours, more than 1,500 tons of incendiary bombs were dropped on the city. The wooden city ignited like gunpowder. Individual fires quickly merged into a single solid sea of flames. A strong night wind, blowing at speeds of up to 45 kilometers per hour, fanned the blaze, turning it into a firestorm similar to the one in Hamburg. Superheated air rushed upwards, creating a hurricane-force draft that sucked people, carts, and debris into the fire. For the residents of Tokyo, it was a night of apocalypse. People trying to escape found themselves in a fiery trap. The streets became red-hot canyons through which a river of fire flowed. The air was so hot that clothing on running people caught fire. Those who tried to take shelter in bunkers were boiled alive or suffocated from carbon monoxide. Thousands of people threw themselves into the icy waters of the canals and the Sumida River, but the water began to boil, and a rain of burning debris fell from above. The American pilots in the final waves saw a sight below them worthy of a Hieronymus Bosch painting. The entire city was one giant bonfire, its flames visible from 250 kilometers away. The nauseating stench of burning human flesh permeated the cockpits. The turbulence from the firestorm was so intense that the bombers were tossed about in the air like wood chips. By morning, it was over. 41 square kilometers of the Japanese capital had been burned to the ground. More than 267,000 buildings were destroyed. By the most conservative estimates, between 80,000 and 100,000 people were killed. More than 1 million were left homeless. In terms of casualties, this single bombing raid surpassed even the future attack on Hiroshima. American losses amounted to just 14 aircraft. General LeMay's insane gamble had paid off. He had found a way to efficiently destroy Japanese cities. The night Tokyo burned was just the first in a series of fire raids. The experiment was deemed a success, and now it was to be repeated on a nationwide scale. The night Tokyo burned was not the end. It was only the beginning. The terrifying success of Operation Meeting House proved to General LeMay that he had found the perfect weapon against Japan, and he was going to use it without hesitation and without pity. Over the next 5 months, the 21st Bomber Command unleashed a methodical and ruthless campaign to burn down every major and medium-sized city in the Japanese Empire. LeMay's list of targets was long. After Tokyo, it was Nagoya's turn, the center of Japan's aviation industry. Then Osaka, one of the largest industrial and port centers. Then Kobe. The scenario was always the same. At night, at low altitude, hundreds of B-29s, loaded with thousands of tons of incendiary bombs, turned another city into a sea of fire. Japanese air defenses were practically helpless. Their night fighters were too slow and poorly equipped to intercept the super fortresses. Anti-aircraft artillery, effective at high altitudes, could not react in time to the low-flying targets. American losses were minimal, while the damage inflicted on Japanese cities was catastrophic. By the summer of 1945, 66 Japanese cities had been subjected to carpet bombing. About 40% of their urban areas had been destroyed. It is estimated that up to 500,000 civilians were killed. Another 15 million were left homeless. Japan was becoming a country of ghost towns. By day, a thick smog hung over the ruins, and at night the horizon was lit by the glow of ever more fires. Industrial production collapsed. Workers who had lost their homes scattered to the countryside. The transportation system was paralyzed. The country was descending into chaos. LeMay had achieved his goal. Japan's economy was broken. But even in the face of this catastrophe, the Japanese military leadership refused to capitulate. The spirit of Ketsugo, the decisive battle on their home soil, was still strong. The militarists in the government were prepared to sacrifice millions of lives rather than accept the shame of defeat. In July, when there were almost no major cities left on LeMay's target list, the American command began a new phase of psychological warfare. Leaflets were dropped from aircraft, listing the next 12 cities doomed to destruction. It was an attempt to break the will of the population and force them to pressure their government. But this too failed to work. The war had reached a stalemate. Japan was effectively defeated, its cities in ruins, its navy sunk, and its economy paralyzed. But it refused to surrender. The Americans, meanwhile, faced a terrible choice: either launch a bloody invasion of the Japanese home islands, which was estimated to cost up to 1 million American lives, or use a new, even more terrible weapon that could end the war with a single blow. And while the armadas of superfortresses continued their campaign of fire on the island of Tinian, at the same airfield from which LeMay's planes took off, an operation was being prepared in the strictest secrecy, one that was destined to change the world forever. The atomic weapon was about to take the stage. By August 1945, Japan lay in ruins, but its will was not broken, and so U.S. President Harry Truman gave the order that would change the world forever. He authorized the use of a new superweapon, born in the crucible of the Manhattan Project. The superfortresses, which had previously sown fiery death, would now unleash the wrath of the atom itself upon Japan. On the morning of August 6th, a B-29 named the Enola Gay took off from the island of Tinian. In its bomb bay was Little Boy, a uranium atomic bomb. The target was the city of Hiroshima, an important military and industrial center. At 8:15 in the morning, the bomb was dropped. 43 seconds later, at an altitude of 600 meters above the city, a second sun ignited. A fireball hundreds of meters in diameter incinerated everything within a kilometer radius. The shockwave, traveling at the speed of sound, wiped most of the city off the face of the earth. Between 70 and 80,000 people were killed instantly. Those closest to the epicenter simply vanished, leaving behind only their shadows on the walls of buildings. Even after this, Japan's military leadership was in no hurry to surrender. They didn't fully comprehend what had happened. And so, 3 days later, on August 9th, a second strike followed. The bomber Boxcar carried a plutonium bomb nicknamed Fat Man. The original target was the city of Kokura, but due to heavy cloud cover, the decision was made to fly to the alternate target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 in the morning, a second atomic sun exploded over Nagasaki. Another 70,000 people were killed. On the same day, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. The combination of these two factors, the atomic bombings and the Soviet entry into the war, finally broke the resistance of the Japanese leadership. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender. The Second World War was over. The legacy of strategic bombing remains a subject of fierce debate to this day. Was it the decisive factor in the victory, or was it a senseless war crime that took the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians? Proponents of the bombings argue that they saved more lives than they took. They point out that the bombings, both conventional and atomic, made a bloody invasion of the Japanese home islands unnecessary, an invasion that could have cost the lives of millions of American and Japanese soldiers. They maintain that it was the fastest and most effective way to end the war. Opponents, however, call the area bombings, barbarism, and state-sponsored terrorism. They point out that the primary targets were not military installations, but the civilian population, and that the main goal was to break their morale, which constitutes a war crime. They argue that by August 45, Japan was already on the verge of defeat due to the naval blockade, and the use of atomic weapons was not a military necessity, but rather an act of intimidation aimed not so much at Japan as at a future geopolitical rival, the Soviet Union. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in the middle. The flying fortresses, born from a dream of a clean surgical war, became in reality an instrument of total destruction. They demonstrated the terrifying power of aviation and erased the line between the front and the home front, between soldier and civilian. The story of strategic bombing is a tragic tale of how the pursuit of technological perfection in the art of killing can lead to a moral catastrophe, and the shadows of Hiroshima and Dresden still weigh on the conscience of the victors, a reminder of the terrible price paid for victory in the Second World War. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. There are more amazing stories to come. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.